Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more.
Welcome to issue number 2 of the Zorro-zine, my video mini-magazine where I creatively discuss gaming as a hobby and as an art form. Every issue will contain 3 pieces, the main topic, the game journal, and the wild card. So without further ado, let's press start and play. If you're like me, when people say they like horror games, I picture in my mind games that heavily rely on grotesque body horror, demonic entities, and zombies. Lots of zombies. And usually these games are high-definition sensory overloads, jam-packed with gross particle effects and loud shrills from whatever monster you are running away from. If I were to say that everyone can play these types of games, I wouldn't have to wait long for a comment saying that horror just isn't my thing, or it's just too scary and gory for my liking. Not everyone can enjoy high-definition, body horror, action, or survival games. But anyone can play horror games, because horror isn't limited to just a few subgenres. On the contrary, I would argue that horror can be found in any kind of game genre, and in any kind of graphical fidelity. If we are willing to be open-minded, we can discover a much more broad and accessible definition of horror games, which may in turn motivate us to give horror a try. I know it did for me. I think a simple compare and contrast will be best to illustrate my point. First, we can examine the games Dead Space and Signalis. Both are survival horror games set in a sci-fi setting, but differ in their graphic fidelity and ultimately their art direction. Dead Space's horror relies heavily on the gore and gross aliens, whereas Signalis has to rely on more abstractions and cryptic ideas to impact the player. Both games scare us, but in different ways. If we then look at horror games outside the survival action genre, Dredge and Animal Well are more in line with the new cozy horror genre. Dredge is a fishing game with a cosmic horror twist, and Animal Well is a pixelated puzzle platformer with ghosts of animals lurking around every corner. Compared to their action/survival horror counterparts, these games are much less visceral in gameplay, and yet, they still count as horror. Between the 4 games, we can create a small grid comparing genre of game, action/survival versus cozy, and fidelity, HD versus lo-fi. Each game fits into a spot on the grid, demonstrating that with just 2 parameters, we can already differentiate 4 kinds of horror games. What's exciting to think about is that there are plenty of other parameters to observe when it comes to horror, like campiness versus seriousness, or length, or mechanical difficulty. The possibilities for finding a niche type of horror game are practically endless, and so are the opportunities to jump into the cold, dark waters of horror and have some real fun. So if you're like me, horror may not be your top choice of genre game, but there's probably a lot more horror games available within your interests that you should go and discover. I love point-and-click games, and I recently discovered Night Manor, a horror point-and-click game, and I'm loving it. I also love low-poly PS1 graphics, and when I heard about Easy Delivery Company, a cozy truck simulator with subtle horror vibes, I honestly didn't mind that those 2 genres were not my top favorite ones. I still really enjoyed giving it a try. So go out there and play a horror game, and let me know what you tried down in the comments below. Welcome to the Game Journal. Today's entry discusses the following game: Tainted Grail: Fall of Avalon, a difficult, dark fantasy, Skyrim-like. 6th of October, 2025. I love the Arthurian legend. King Arthur, Lancelot, and Merlin are characters I love to read about, both in history and fiction. So when I learned that Tainted Grail: Fall of Avalon was influenced by these myths, I was really intrigued. Upon booting the game up, Mentions of Arthur, Druids, and Excalibur confirmed my interest. The only issue I found myself confronted with was the tone of the games. Grim, gritty, edgy, and gothic are all accurate words that describe Fall of Avalon's tone and aesthetics. King Arthur's face is not shown, but rather is hidden behind a scary helmet resembling a skeleton, crowned with spikes. His tomb is not an ordinary castle catacomb, but a hellish bone structure with rivers of blood. This all surprised me, and at first I welcomed it timidly. I don't usually get into these types of games because it just feels a bit like the phrase, "I'm 14 and this is deep," as if made for an audience I no longer relate with. But even with my personal hang-ups on the vibe of Fall of Avalon, what really pushes me away from playing more is the writing and voice acting. I find myself skipping through dialogue as fast as I can, which is not at all how I play RPGs like The Elder Scrolls and Fallout. The tone, story, and characters just simply aren't clicking with me. I'm only about 4 hours in, and I want to give it another hour or so before I put it down. Maybe the parts I do enjoy, like the combat and exploration, will draw me in deeper. But for now, things are looking grim for King Arthur. Sincerely, Zorro. Before we close, I wanted to take some time and discuss this comment from Joey V5P and just give a short reply to their comment. So what is your favorite aspect of game development? And do you think that games should be something you make for yourself or an audience? I really enjoy working in Pico 8, specifically the pixel editor and the sound editor. Those are what I have a lot of fun in. So probably the art design of making games. And I really do think that for most of us, we should be just making games for ourselves. It's great when you want to make a game for other people, but most people, we're not going to be working at a games company. We're mostly just hobbyists, I imagine. I just focus on your interests and what you're interested about. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.